It's such a pleasure to be here with you at this festival today, and particularly to be alongside such fantastic panellists. So thank you on both counts. I'm speaking today on Compose Yourself, the potential of autism life writing and fiction for demasking and constructing identity. Before I begin, I would just like to make you aware that there is some brief discussion of mental illness and suicide. In a world where research and texts on autism seem to gain value and traction by being reified through a neurotypical voice, life writing, as we already know, is an important vehicle for changing the power relations. It presents the opportunity to put forward an alternative portrayal when autism is far too often subject to misconceptions and stereotypes. The role of fiction in this regard is somewhat more complex, since it doesn't necessarily have to be underpinned by a lived experience. As Garden 2010 says, and we can see here on the slide, the relationship between autobiographical narration and the lived experience of social relationships is not mimetic or transparent, but rather complex and inflected by interacting concerns relating to memory, perception, selfhood, the realities of literary publication, and generic convention. I will present two texts today: Amy Arnold's novel Slip of a Fish, and Camilla Pang's autobiographical work Explaining Humans. Despite one text being life writing and the other work of fiction, I feel that these texts speak to each other. Of course, every experience is individual and unique, but these two texts are united in communicating an experience of living in a world that doesn't fully understand or appreciate the value of autistic perspectives. The texts reinforce and corroborate each other to put pressure on society and question how and why we privilege one very particular way of seeing the world over others. Masking, as a result of feeling pressure to fit in or abide by unwritten social scripts, can have detrimental effects on mental health. The negative outcomes associated with masking can range from exhaustion and burnout to severe mental illness and suicidality. It is for this reason I would here like to frame it as a protective coping mechanism rather than a conscious choice. My argument will begin by exploring how Camilla Pang addresses masking in her text, before exploring Amy Arnold's use of ambiguity and diverse communication methods to reach beyond this. Dr. Camilla Pang, author of Explaining Humans, said that she misrepresents autism by virtue of occupying a set of characteristics specific only to herself. So we can see that indeed any individual would, to a certain extent, misrepresent autism. She says that to draw any conclusions from her experience in isolation would be a disservice to the very diversity of autism. Pang retrospectively created the handbook she felt she needed when she was growing up in writing this book. It is a guide for understanding humans and all their unpredictable behaviours. She now works as a postdoctoral scientist in bioinformatics, and she relates scientific theories that she uses in her career to the behaviours of humans, and her text is essentially a running commentary of how, in doing so, she's able to make sense of the highly social world that surrounds her. Pang explores the very nature of what it means to be human, and she says she does this from a privileged position in her opinion, as she exists just outside the threshold of normal and so is able to examine it. This said, she does not feel that it has always been a privileged position, and she depicts how, through attempting to fit in, she eroded her sense of self and her precious individuality. As per the quote we can see here, "I had made such a conscious effort to erase my biases and preferences, to get rid of those messy vulnerabilities, that I no longer knew what I cared about. I felt as though my spirit had fossilized, and I hadn't so much forgotten a few things as completely lost myself in the mental mist. I felt instantly, crushingly sad, and then scared. What had I done to myself?" This quote is one instance of many throughout the text that are indicative of the internalization of medical models in Pang's experience. She takes particular ownership of her masking as though it were a, quote, conscious effort. Referring to her vulnerabilities as messy represents how, in order to fit in, Pang felt she had to reject interdependence entirely, which is a natural part of life, although some social scripts will tell you otherwise. Living an autonomous life somehow becomes a goal, but also is completely and inherently impossible. Despite her borderline traumatic experience of attempting to fit in, as just discussed, this unfortunately is not an isolated event, as she then goes on to state, "I'm not a reticent person. I am an enthusiastic giggler, a squealer in delight, and a nostril-flaring howler in rage. My emotions have rarely been a closed book to anyone, but I wanted to experiment. I wanted to become more reserved, to be more neutral, and to enjoy the benefits of this seemingly more objective stance in life, which seemed to be the hypothetical optimum. This wasn't just shutting down my mental computer, but restoring it to its factory settings." These factory settings that Pang notes allude to a norm that perhaps any difference is a deviation from and that we should all be aiming to return to, supposedly. The fact that Pang cites her giggling or any other unbridled emotion as problematic or worthy of being erased highlights how personal she feels the problem is, rather than one founded in society. In this passage, she's actually referring to the traditional British Stoicism, in the stiff upper lip sense rather than the truly philosophical one. She sees this as a so-called optimum behaviour. Although it's intended with humour in an almost self-deprecating, light-hearted way that we see throughout the entire text, it does just further compound how much stands to be lost. In the analogy, the multiplicity of global culture stands to be replaced with a very restrained objectivity, a very bleak outlook, I would say. Diversity is invaluable, yet stands to be elided if it's not appreciated, as shown in Pang's work, and she claims to have some control over her masking, but no matter how much she is pained, she frequently returns to it, so I would say that this is questionable. This is perhaps something we could hope to be rid of through better understanding and accommodation from society. Pang alludes to medical models that she unwittingly seems to have A, internalised, and B, herself feed into throughout her text. In a similar way, fictional texts, despite acknowledgement that they are not based on fact, still feed into cultural understandings of autism. There are many ethical dilemmas that I don't have the time to expand on today, such as who has the rights to speak of or author autistic experience. Add to these ethical dilemmas the pressure from publishers, and we often get a marketable version of autism, where a character may exist to advance the moral trajectory of other characters, or we see them abiding by traditional recovery trajectories. This is problematic as it attempts to say that there is a normal standard in which we may all return, rather than appreciating unique difference. Cowser hits the nail on the head as he says we may be granted access to the literary marketplace on the condition that stories conform to preferred paradigms. It's as though the publishing industry asserts certain conditions as a prerequisite to reaching a mainstream audience. The more mainstream these representations become, the more quickly they percolate through society, potentially carrying that misinformation with them. It is for this reason that I feel Amy Arnold's text, Slip of a Fish, is an exciting example of neurodiverse literature. Arnold intentionally, quote, left uncertainty hanging in the air, end quote, in her novel. It is precisely this ambiguity that opens a dialogue between autism life writing and fiction, where the two could work together to challenge and enrich existing representations. Anna Stenning herself, in her fantastic book from 2020, asserts that there have conceivably been 3 waves or generations of autism life writing since 1980, the most recent of which intercepts more widely into the world than just within cultural understandings of autism. Now, I understand that Slip of a Fish, by virtue of being fiction, exists slightly external to these discussions, but I would argue nonetheless that it does offer some really interesting potential that could be transferred across to either life writing or writing in general. It is representative of perhaps the future where a label is not a necessary prerequisite to awareness, acceptance, and appreciation. It's a timely indication of fiction's potential to emphasise difference as a valuable and powerful force to disrupt the accepted hegemony. The Fish is an intricately interior portrait of a woman dealing with an unspecified trauma. It tackles themes of gender, sexuality, and motherhood against the backdrop of the narrator struggling to construct her identity due to the disjuncture of her neurodivergence with the society around her. Speaking on a panel discussing autism in 2018, Arnold, who herself identifies as broadly and unspecified neurodivergent, stated that the narrator had definite autistic tendencies, but she didn't find it useful to use this label within the book, as it encourages readers to approach the text with certain assumptions. Instead, the reader is immersed in a narrative that purposely omits as many details as it includes. This leaves the reader unable to draw any firm conclusions and can only speculate, symbolic, I would say, of the diverse nature of neurodiversity. Arnold's decision not to label difference, combined with her narrative structure that actively engages the reader, we are implicated in understanding neurodiversity through very reading of the novel. External to discussions of autism specifically, the novel represents a woman employing coping mechanisms after a traumatic experience or a mental breakdown. The only dialectic markers that pass time are before and since. And they are focused around an unnamed event that we are never quite privy to the specificities of. The narrative toys with, but ultimately resists becoming a recovery trajectory. Arnold shows an awareness of this recovery pressure in a poignant discussion between the narrator and her husband, Ash and Abbott. Ash states, "I don't like doctors. Said they read the wrong kinds of books, and Abbott said, nonsense, although Papa knew. Said doctors were men in chairs and you can't trust men in chairs." Read as constituting an autism narrative, this appears to be a direct reference to the harm we may feel that can ensue from unnecessary medicalisation, and thus the anxiety that may be felt towards medical professionals about their view on difference more generally. The dialogue, unfortunately, takes a turn towards becoming pathological, as Abbott states, "We are once and for all sorting this out." The specificity of which contrasts with the ambiguity elsewhere in Ash's narration, and indeed in how she sees herself. Once again, control appears to be taken away from Ash, with her husband acting as a gatekeeper who is apparently permitted to sort her neurological difference. Although this episode could potentially relate to the couple attempting marriage counselling or more general therapy, such is the beauty of the ambiguity throughout the novel, it nonetheless demonstrates a distrust towards medical professionals. The experience, therefore, becomes medicalised regardless of the event. The novel dethrones verbality as a privileged form of communication, to assert that if we could better understand diverse means of communication, masking would effectively become redundant entirely. The novel's championing of neurodiversity rests in the narrator playing with the musicality of language. Ash subordinates the usual use of language, returning it to an art form rather than a reduction to pure meaning. This offers the potential to more completely capture an experience and her relationship with the environment. She has an affinity to swimming in open water that allow her to access a sense of peace and clarity. Attempting to fit this experience into the restricted boxes of language may fall short. This is exemplified in the passage here, where Ashley's rich interior dialogue is not done justice by the speech expressions that others are witness to. "I sat down next to her, pulled my knees up to my chin and listened to her oceanic breath. I listened to the rain on the window, to cars taking the crest of our hill. I listened to the swifts, to the crows, to the openings and the shuttings. I listened to the voices, children's, women's, to words surfacing here and there, finding their way up through the oceanic breath. I listened. I listened to her. I held my knees to my chin and I listened. In and out. In and out. Rain too. Voices, birds, cars. I was listening. I was asking myself, what does this sound like? All of this together, It sounds like waves, I said. She smiled a little. Not too much, not enough to stop the ocean's swell. The passage offers a really interesting inversion of typical agency between animate and inanimate objects. The car is anthropomorphized in being given an active verb, whilst there's no agent mentioned with regards to the ball being kicked or the openings and shuttings. Moreover, the words are actually active participants in the passage, as they find their way up through the oceanic breath. The materiality and physicality of words is something that the novel returns to often, which is just one strand of destabilizing ideas of verbal language as superior. There's also a cinematic sense of Ash panning across and considering the landscape in its sonorous entirety, what it all sounds like together, before she then refocuses in on her conversation with Kate. Her internal reflection is contrasted against her external connection. Ash appears to be in communication with all elements of her environment, which, by prioritising the importance of sound over conventional semantics, Arnold immerses the reader in a soundscape that is equivalent to the one that Ash is enjoying. In my research more widely, I argue that the narrative style of Slip of a Fish is an example and has parallels to trauma writing. The trauma could relate to either the unnamed event or, more widely, into the feeling of being marginalised from society by a difference, and the discrimination that she feels as a result of her different perception of the world. And whilst I don't have enough time to go into this in particular as much as I would like to, I would argue that in regards to the exact literary devices that Arnold uses, she's able to frame masking as a coping mechanism or trauma response. And this highlights the toll that such an act can take on an individual, and highlights that the burden of adaptation should rest firmly within society rather than within the individual. Within early models of trauma theory, there was a tendency to say it was unspeakable or resisted narration, which unfortunately we have heard many people say about experiences of autism. And I would argue that I refute both of these, as I think many scholars are beginning to, and put together more nuanced ideas of presenting trauma and autism in literature. Ash's trauma is narrated through every interaction she has with people and her environment. It is reflected in her speech, in her thought patterns, in her relationships and her outlooks. If it resists narration at all, it is only because the marginalisation of people who are different to the majority is so deeply ingrained within society that it risks passing as imperceptible. The conversation that emerges between life writing and fiction draws attention to such discrimination that may be rendered less visible due to masking or accepted social scripts. And this conversation that is created, I would argue, is invaluable in beginning to unpick and destabilise these entrenched values. Thank you for your attention. I welcome any questions or feedback you may have.